In the history of warfare, sieges are usually broken by artillery, by tanks, or by the starvation of the innocent. But in 1948, a siege was broken by something entirely different: logistics, flour, and coal. We are looking at the C-47 Skymaster, a silver bird roaring over a landscape of absolute devastation. Below it lies Berlin. The year is 1948, and the dust has barely settled from the Second World War. The world assumed peace had arrived, but in the ruins of the German capital, a new kind of war was beginning. This wasn't a war of bullets, but a war of wills. It was the first major confrontation of the Cold War. The superpowers that had crushed Hitler were now turning on each other. The stakes were nothing less than the future of Europe. If Berlin fell to Soviet control, the rest of the continent might follow. Welcome to the story of the Berlin Airlift. Over the next hour, we will explore how a massive humanitarian gamble turned into the greatest logistical triumph in history. We will see how pilots risked their lives to feed a former enemy, and how the sound of engines in the sky became the sound of freedom. To understand the danger, we must look at the map. Following the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, the victorious Allies took a knife to the map of Germany. They carved the defeated nation into 4 distinct occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Look at the green and orange areas to the west. These are the American and British zones. To the east, in dark gray, lies the Soviet zone. Now, look closely at Berlin. Berlin was the capital, and it too was divided into 4 sectors. But there was a critical geographic problem. Berlin was located deep inside the Soviet zone. It was an island of Western influence surrounded by a sea of Soviet military control. Or the Western Allies, the US, UK, and France, their sectors in Berlin were indefensible outposts. They were over 100 miles from friendly territory. There was no physical connection to the West, except for a few highways, railways, and canals that the Soviets controlled. The geopolitical trap was set. All Stalin had to do was close his hand, and West Berlin would be crushed. Tensions had been simmering for years, but the spark that ignited the crisis was economic. By 1948, the German currency was worthless. Cigarettes were used more often than cash. The Western Allies knew that for Europe to recover, Germany had to function. So in June 1948, they made a bold move. They introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark. The goal was to stabilize the economy and curb the rampant inflation that was starving the population. It worked. Shop windows suddenly filled with goods. But to the Soviet Union, this wasn't economic aid. It was an act of aggression. Stalin was furious. He viewed the Western currency as a direct threat to his control over East Germany. He retaliated immediately by creating the Ostmark for the East. But he knew he couldn't win an economic competition. If the West prospered while the East starved, Soviet ideology would crumble. He needed to force the Western Allies out of Berlin once and for all. He didn't need an army to do it. He just needed to strangle the economy. On the 24th of June, 1948, the trap snapped shut. The Soviets claimed technical difficulties and cut off all rail, road, and canal routes leading into West Berlin. The message was clear: no food, no coal, no medicine would enter the city from the west. Imagine the panic. West Berlin had a population of 2.5 million people. These were civilians, families, elderly, children, living in the bombed-out shell of a city. Suddenly, they were severed from the world. The blockade was absolute. The power plants in West Berlin relied on coal from the west. Without it, the lights went out. Factories stopped. The city was left stranded, without food, fuel, or electricity. The Soviet calculation was brutal, but logical. They believed the Western Allies would have only two choices: surrender the city to Soviet control, or watch 2.5 million people starve to death. It was a siege of medieval proportions in the middle of the 20th century. In Washington and London, panic set in. This was the Allied dilemma. The options on the table were grim. Option 1, withdrawal. They could leave Berlin. But the leaders knew that withdrawal would signal weakness. It would mean abandoning the policy of containment entirely. If they backed down here, who would trust them to defend Paris or Rome? Option 2, military action. General Clay proposed sending an armed convoy of tanks down the Autobahn to smash the blockade. But in 1948, the Soviets had vastly superior ground forces in Europe. A tank battle could trigger World War III, and with nuclear weapons now in existence, that meant catastrophe. But there was a third option, a loophole. A 1945 treaty had guaranteed 3 air corridors, highways in the sky, 20 miles wide. The Soviets controlled the ground, but they had agreed, in writing, to leave these air lanes open. The solution was an unprecedented air bridge. They would try to feed an entire metropolis from the sky. Every great historical event needs a commander with nerves of steel. For the Berlin Airlift, that man was General Lucius D. Clay. Clay was the U.S. military governor of Germany. He was known for his unyielding, stubborn personality and his unwavering stance against Soviet expansion. While politicians in Washington dithered and worried about costs, Clay saw the bigger picture. He famously declared, "If we lose Berlin, we lose all of Europe." To him, Berlin was the domino that could not fall. When the blockade began, the Air Force told him it was impossible. They said there weren't enough planes in the world to feed a city that size. Clay ignored them. He ordered the airlift to begin, despite widespread doubt from his own government. He called General Curtis LeMay and simply asked, "Can you haul coal?" LeMay replied, "We can haul anything." The order was given. The birds would fly. Let's break down the sheer impossibility of the task. This was a logistics challenge that defied logic. Planners calculated the absolute minimum weight required to keep the city alive. Not comfortable, just alive. They needed flour, dried potatoes, milk, and most importantly, coal. The magic number was 4,000 tons daily. 4,000 tons, every single day, rain or shine. The obstacles were immense. They had limited runways inside Berlin. Tempelhof was built for small fighters, not heavy cargo transports. The weather in Germany was notorious for heavy fog, and then there was the enemy. The planes had to fly through narrow air corridors over hostile Soviet territory. The Soviets harassed them constantly, but the math remained the same. If the daily tonnage dropped, people froze. If it dropped further, they starved. It was a conveyor belt that could never stop moving. The early days of the airlift were chaotic. It was nicknamed the cowboy operation because it was disorganized and dangerous. That changed with the arrival of one man, Lieutenant General William Tunner. Tunner was a logistics genius. His nickname was Willie the Whip because of his strict discipline. When he arrived, he looked at the chaos and decided to turn the airlift into a machine. He implemented a strict rhythmic schedule. He synchronized the entire operation like a ballet. Planes were ordered to land exactly at 3-minute intervals. They were stacked at different altitudes in the corridor to maximize space. Tunner was ruthless about efficiency. He noticed that pilots were wasting time getting off the planes to grab a snack or check weather. So, he brought the weather briefings and snacks to the cockpit. He ordered crews to stay aboard during unloading. A plane would land, unload in minutes, and take off again without the engines ever shutting down. To haul this much cargo, the Allies needed heavy lifters. The hero of this story is the C-54 Skymaster. In the beginning, they used smaller C-47s, but they simply couldn't carry enough. The C-54 became the primary workhorse. It could carry 10 tons of cargo. These planes were stripped of everything unnecessary to save weight. They carried everything from sacks of flour to crates of dried milk. But it wasn't just the Americans. The British Royal Air Force played a crucial role with their Sunderland flying boats. These massive aircraft landed on the lakes of Berlin. They were particularly important because they were treated to resist corrosion, so they were used to transport salt, a substance that would eat through the floor of a normal plane. Keeping these fleets in the air was a nightmare. Mechanics worked 24/7 on aging aircraft. They worked outdoors in the snow and rain, patching up engines that were being run far past their limits. By the spring of 1949, the operation had become a well-oiled machine, but General Tunner wanted to drive a stake through the heart of Soviet confidence. He wanted to prove that the airlift wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. He chose April 16, 1949, for a maximum effort event known as the Easter Parade. The goal was simple: break all records. For 24 hours, the tarmac never stayed dry. Planes were landing and taking off in a continuous stream. The results were staggering. In a single 24-hour period, they delivered 12,941 tons of supplies. That is equivalent to 600 rail cars. They shattered all tonnage records. It was a logistical masterstroke. Tunner had organized this specifically to demoralize the Soviets. The message was undeniable. We can do this forever. We can supply this city better by air than you ever did by rail. When we think of the airlift, we often think of food, but the most critical cargo was actually the black gold, coal. Berlin winters are brutal. Without fuel, people would freeze to death in their apartments. But transporting coal by aircraft is a pilot's nightmare. Coal is heavy, dirty, and dangerous. It comes in sacks that leak. The coal dust would seep out during flight, drifting into the cockpit. It got into the electrical controls, risking short circuits. It got into the cables. Worst of all, it got into the crew's lungs. Despite the danger, tons of it had to be flown in every day. It remained essential for heating homes and generating the electricity that kept the city running. Every time a Berlin family boiled water or turned on a light, they were using energy that had been flown in through a narrow corridor in the sky. Amidst the grime of coal and the roar of engines, a moment of humanity emerged that would define the entire operation. It started with a young pilot named Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen. One day, Halvorsen was at the fence of Tempelhof Airport filming planes. He met a group of German children. These kids were living in ruins, often hungry, but Halvorsen noticed something striking. They didn't beg, unlike other war orphans across Europe who would clamor for chocolate. These children were too proud, or perhaps too used to disappointment. Moved by their dignity, Halvorsen reached into his pocket. He only had 2 sticks of gum. He broke them in half and passed them through the fence. The children shared the tiny pieces, and those who didn't get any just smelled the wrappers. Halvorsen made a promise right there. He told them to watch his plane the next day. He said he would wiggle his wings as a signal. He promised to drop candy using tiny parachutes made from handkerchiefs. True to his word, Halvorsen wiggled his wings and pushed the candy out of the flare chute. The children went wild. He did it again the next day, and the next. Soon, other pilots joined in. What started as one man's kindness exploded into Operation Little Vittles. Halvorsen's gesture went viral. Back in the United States, the story captured the public's imagination. Schools and candy companies began donating tons of sweets to the cause. It wasn't just about sugar. It was a psychological victory. For 3 years, American planes had dropped bombs on these children. Now they were dropping chocolate. It won the hearts of an entire German generation. It transformed the Americans from occupiers into saviors, and the Germans from enemies into friends. While the pilots were the heroes in the air, the people of Berlin were the heroes on the ground. Life in blockaded Berlin was a test of endurance. Strict rationing was enforced. The diet was monotonous and meager, mostly dried potatoes and powdered eggs. Fresh meat or fruit was a distant memory. Electricity was a luxury. It was available for only 4 hours a day. People had to cook, clean, and work in that short window. The winter of 1948 was cold. Desperate for heat, Berliners chopped down the trees in the famous Tiergarten Park for fuel. The Soviets tried to break them. They offered fresh food and extra coal to anyone who would register in the East and trade their ration card. It was a tempting offer for a starving family. Yet overwhelmingly, the Berliners refused. They refused to surrender their freedom for Soviet food. They chose hunger over submission. The airlift was a peaceful mission, but it was flown in a combat zone. The Soviets were frustrated by the airlift's success, and they turned to harassment. They couldn't simply shoot down the planes. That would be an act of war and would trigger a nuclear response. So they played a dangerous game of chicken. Soviet Yak fighters would buzz the cargo planes, flying incredibly close at high speeds to terrify the transport pilots. At night, they would shine blinding searchlights directly into the cockpits of landing aircraft, trying to blind the pilots. They even used electronic warfare. They jammed radios and broadcast fake navigation signals to try and lure planes off course and into a crash. But the Allied pilots held their nerve. They ignored the threats, ignored the fighters off their wingtips, and kept flying. The mission was too important to be grounded by fear. We must never forget that the Bridge of Air was built on sacrifice. The cost of freedom was paid in blood. Flying heavily loaded planes in bad weather on tight schedules 24 hours a day is inherently dangerous. Fatigue was a constant killer. Mechanical failure was always one flight away. The statistics are tragic. 31 American airmen lost their lives. 39 British airmen made the ultimate sacrifice. They died in crashes in the fog, in mid-air collisions. And mechanical failures. These men had survived the horrors of World War II only to die delivering flour to their former enemies. Today, at Tempelhof Airport, the Berlin Airlift Memorial stands as a tribute to these brave souls. The 3 prongs of the monument represent the 3 air corridors that kept a city alive. By May 1949, the writing was on the wall. The Soviet strategy had backfired spectacularly. Stalin realized the blockade was a complete failure. Instead of starving West Berlin into submission, he had spurred the West to create the most efficient supply line in history. The airlift was now supplying more tonnage by air than the trains had previously brought by rail. On May 12, 1949, the siege ended. The Soviets lifted the barriers without fanfare. The electricity was turned back on. The trains rolled again. It was a quiet admission of defeat. But the Allies didn't stop immediately. They didn't trust the Soviets not to close the roads again. The airlift continued until September to build up a massive surplus of reserves. They wanted to ensure that if the track snapped shut again, Berlin would be ready. The end of the blockade wasn't just a victory for Berlin. It changed the geopolitical landscape of the world forever. The political consequences were profound. The crisis proved that the West needed to stand together militarily. In April 1949, right before the blockade ended, NATO was formed. This created a powerful Western military alliance against Soviet expansion. It was also the first major victory for the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment. It proved that Soviet aggression could be stopped without firing a shot. Most importantly, it changed the narrative. The Germans were no longer seen just as Nazis. In the eyes of the West, they had been transformed into victims of communism worthy of protection. However, the division of Germany was now solidified. West Germany, the FRG, and East Germany, the GDR, became separate nations. The Iron Curtain had hardened into concrete. When we look back at the Berlin Airlift, the sheer scale of the operation is hard to comprehend. The statistics tell the story of a logistical miracle. The operation lasted for 15 months. In that time, Allied pilots flew a staggering 278,000 total flights. They covered 92 million miles. To put that in perspective, that is almost the distance from the Earth to the Sun. And they delivered 2.3 million tons of cargo. Mountains of coal, lakes of fuel, and hills of flour. It was the greatest transport operation the world had ever seen, and perhaps ever will see. The Berlin Airlift was more than just a military operation. It was a defining moment for humanity. It demonstrated air power as a humanitarian tool. Before 1948, bombers were for destroying cities. After 1948, the world knew they could also save them. It established the model for all future humanitarian airlifts worldwide. It leaves us with questions to ponder. Was the risk of nuclear war worth saving Berlin? History suggests it was. It drew a line in the sand that defined the next 40 years of peace in Europe, and it taught us about the power of symbols. How soft power, represented by a handkerchief parachute holding a chocolate bar, could help win the war of ideas. The Berlin Airlift proved that while you can blockade a road, you cannot blockade the sky, and you certainly cannot blockade the human spirit.